We're about to see a lot of whinging and complaining from some of Australia's biggest corporate welfare bludgers, that being property investors. The federal Labor government's changes to the capital gains tax discount and negative gearing is bound to upset a lot of people, hurt the feelings of our favorite characters, developers, landlords. Part of the reason why I think it's worthwhile supporting the changes is just to see the tirade on social media.
I want Jim Chalmers to look straight down the camera and answer this question. If this was always the plan, why didn't you tell the Australians before the election?
And while that's great, that's fantastic, we love to see it. Unfortunately, the changes themselves, the effects they're going to have is pretty minuscule. It's going to be pretty negligible. And that goes for both ways. So people who think it's going to crash the market and ruin housing in this country, relax. And also people who are celebrating, saying we're on the path to fix our housing affordability crisis. If you want an in-depth explanation as to why tweaking particular tax settings like the capital gains tax or negative gearing won't fix our housing crisis, shocker, I know, I've got a 50-minute video explaining here in depth as to why that's the case. But before we get to all that kind of stuff, we should probably acknowledge just how bad the capital gains tax discount is, how poorly designed negative gearing, the capital gains tax discount, all that kind of stuff. It's not conducive to anything except the potential gains of investors. We are literally, with public money, subsidizing financial instability. So the way in which the capital gains tax discount works is you only pay tax on 50% of the total gain you make. So let's say you buy a house for $500,000 and then later down the track, you want to sell it for $1 million, right? And let's say you successfully sell it. You only pay tax on $500,000 on 50% of the income you make, right? The rest of the income is tax-free. Then you've got negative gearing. Negative gearing is when you have a rental property. So let's say you've bought a property and you're renting it out to some tenants, but the whole operations is a net financial loss. You're not making any money, and in fact, you're losing money. You can claim that loss on your taxes. You don't have to pay it through expenses or whatever. You can claim it through your taxes. And that way you're able to maintain the operations, but not go into the red, basically, right? So you can really clearly see that we are just propping up the poor investment decisions of property investors in this economy, right? And this kind of stuff reminds me of this economist called Hyman Minsky and his concept known as financial fragility. Essentially, increasingly over time, investors will take on more and more debt that they increasingly can't afford. And what happens is they take on debt on the basis that their investments, the future value of their investments will grow enough to which then when they sell it, they can then pay back the rest of their debt. So what does that mean, right? Let's say I get money from a bank and I bought a house and I can't afford to pay back my mortgage, right? With my regular cash flow, my regular income. I'm like, okay, I'm going to wait for this property to grow in value for the next 20 years. And then after 20 years, I'm going to sell it and then use the proceeds when I sold it to then pay back the rest of my mortgage. So instead of being able to pay back your debt with your regular income or your regular cash flow, you are dependent upon the price of your asset to increase to the point where you can sell it and make back the rest of the debt, right? As you can imagine, that creates a lot of financial instability when that's the entire economy. And that's essentially what we're incentivizing with the capital gains tax discount and negative gearing. In fact, we can see this in the literature. For example, this paper here, they did a study on investors and what they do and how they use negative gearing. And essentially, negative gearing is being used to cushion any net rental loss during periods of low yield while expecting capital growth over their holding period. So in other words, property investor dole budgets are expecting the Australian public to subsidize their fragile and unstable operations so they can continually bid up the price of housing up and make it more and more expensive for the rest of us. Now, the wave of whinging you'll hear over the next few days, a lot of it will be like, oh, by decreasing these concessions or whatnot, you're hurting the little guy, you're disincentivizing young Aussies to get into the market and buy their first investment property and all that, right? And typically, many on the left will respond by saying that the top 1% overwhelmingly are the ones who benefit from things like negative gearing or the capital gains tax discount. And they are 100% correct, right? That is absolutely true. There is real inequality there. In fact, people who tend to earn income from assets are typically much wealthier than people who tend to earn income from their regular income, wages, right? But what these people get wrong, what the left gets wrong, is that Australians just love property. Like, there's no getting around it. There are more property investors in this country than unemployed people. And if anything, sometimes those smaller, wholesome landlords, they tend to be the worst offenders in terms of financial fragility, as they don't have the income or cash flow or revenue that a bigger property investor has. And so they're more reliant on the price of housing potentially growing bigger in the future so they can sell and then pay back the rest of their debt with that capital gain. And while property investors are absolutely the pointy end of the stick, we've got to remember that nearly 70% of Australians own their own private property. This kind of gets into why, getting rid of the CGT discount or negative gearing won't fix the housing crisis. The way we've set up the economy in this country is so unbelievably cooked. Like, it is genuinely insane to think about how much economic growth, not even growth, just stability, just baseline stability is tied to real estate going up and up and up, right? Now, this is because of wide-ranging, paradigm-shifting economic changes in Australia in the 1980s and 1990s. But the essence of it is it became a lot easier to borrow money in this country and for banks to lend out money in this country. And what this did was dramatically increase what's called the effective demand of consumers, or in other words, by giving people a bunch more credit to access via banks, you're able to massively pump up the amount of assets they are able to demand, and therefore the price of these assets. Now, for a bunch of reasons, which I go over in these videos, Australians and our financial institutions were biased towards property. In fact, Australian banks crowded out commercial loans in favor of residential mortgages, and they still do. This has meant that today, 60% of bank lending in this country goes into residential mortgages. Now, this is really important for a number of reasons. Obviously, any capitalist economy, banking is integral to how that system works. But in Australia in particular, 90% of our financial system is made up of the big four banks. And the big four banks are also the biggest four stocks on the ASX. So they are not only integral to our economy by virtue of being financial institutions, but also just a large section of our economy. So rather than coal, iron, mining, gas, etc., rather than those things which people typically think Australia is reliant on, in reality, our financial system and in turn our housing market is the actual engine of the Australian economy. And yeah, as I said before, the majority of Australians are homeowners, and so they are bought into this system. They are financially incentivized to want the price of housing to continually go up and up. Where it gets potentially dangerous and fragile is when a small but growing part of that homeowner block needs house prices to increase and increase, otherwise they go bankrupt or they go into what's called negative equity. And enough negative equity in the economy will cause a financial crisis. In fact, we saw in the GFC that about 20% of households fell into negative equity. But anyway, as we went over, these financial settings were constructed in the 1980s and 1990s, and they are so much more integral, influential, and fundamental to our housing unaffordability crisis than any tax concession today is or could be. And look, if you don't understand that, I've got many more videos talking about that kind of stuff. But if you're sick of me, Dr. Martin Duck's PhD thesis is probably the best piece of literature on the housing crisis in this country. If you really want to wrap your head around and understand historically and contemporarily our housing problems in this country, I cannot recommend his work enough. It is vital to understanding this stuff. But again, I'm not saying we shouldn't get rid of the CGT discount or negative gearing. They're bad policies, they're ineffective, they're inequitable, etc., etc. We should get rid of them. It's great that we are, but getting rid of them is not going to fix our housing crisis. I mean, this is reflected in the literature. The RBA, for example, published a paper where they found that overall there'll be a net gain in welfare in the economy, but there would only be a 2% drop in house prices over 5 years. So again, nothing monumental over here. In fact, because of how necessary and integral housing is to the function of this economy, the government can't let the housing market crash. It can't let house prices fall too much. Even if it wanted to, right? Let's say it wanted to, the RBA would just step in and artificially prop up house prices like they did during COVID. And they said as much, right? So if we're having a conversation about bad policies, sure, getting rid of the CGT discount and negative gearing is great. Go ahead, do it, fantastic. But any illusions that this will cause a massive drop in house prices and make housing affordable and accessible again, it's just rubbish. It's unfounded, and that's exactly what they are. They're illusions. If you want to learn more about how cooked housing is in this country, go watch these videos. And also join your union, join Rahu.